All right, so this is going up on my channel, so I guess I might as well kick off, although I'm by no means the host or the boss here. This is very much a joint effort. So Josh and I are acquaintances slash friends from various different online groups. I think we probably met at Rebel Wisdom originally, and we're involved in Glass Bead games together and a couple of other regular calls. And so we've come to know each other quite well over the last year or two. And we have quite different perspectives on a few things. And so that's why we're here as a pair. And we're going to go through some of the COVID released videos from various different people. We're going to start with ZDogg today and pick out bits that bug either of us or that either of us think are particularly good and have a discussion between the two of us. The idea being that, well, two things for me anyway. I mean, Josh can say what he thinks, but for me, there's two parts to it. Firstly, modeling dialogue between people who disagree about things, right? And you know, how to have discussions without breaking down into slanging matches. And secondly, hopefully, maybe we can arrive at some syntheses through the discussion that didn't come up in the videos themselves. So that's me.
Yeah, I would just add that I feel like the meeting place that was the closest to generating this was sort of a sense-making call that we have pretty much every week with a group that came out of the Rebel Wisdom Festival, I think in 2020. And so we've been, you know, gathering and talking about current events and yeah, just our sense of various different topics. It's certainly not all about, you know, pandemic related stuff, but, you know, a lot of philosophy and other things. But and in the course of that, one of the channels that I started paying attention to, because I've generally been interested in, you know, trying to understand various perspectives and kind of where's the truth in the combination of those perspectives. And the Zubin Damania MD, the ZDogg MD channel, yeah, actually, I first got exposed to him through a Rebel Wisdom interview. I just really appreciated he's got like background in integral theory, and he kind of brings that to bear. He talks about alt-middle, looking for just that same sort of principle of, you know, his knowledge. He's got a background as a physician and otherwise, and you know, paying attention to various perspectives and then looking for, you know, well, where's the bias, where's the truth, and looking for that kind of synthesis. So I shared a clip from, I believe I shared the clip where he was critiquing the dialogue between Joe Rogan and Dr. Peter McCullogh. And that's kind of where we had a few differences of opinion around things that he was saying and conclusions he was drawing. So yeah, just looking to kind of get into that a bit.
Yeah, I mean, let me just jump on the back of that as well, because I think it's going to become apparent that I'm probably, broadly speaking, the more critical of ZDogg than you are, right? And I don't want it to come across that I don't think he's a bad guy, is what I'm trying to say. Like, I don't doubt for one second that he's well-intentioned, that he is genuinely trying to do a good job of what he's doing. It's just, in my opinion, he fails on several important occasions. And so, and I would imagine from his presentation that he would actually appreciate a video like this, you know, like good faith critiquing of what it is that he's trying to do. I would like to think that he would actually appreciate something, not necessarily this one, but the spirit in which it's being done. I would like to think he would appreciate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, he says, you know, he asks for comments and pushback on the channel, you know, whether in the comments or otherwise. So yeah, practices that pretty well. One other thing that came to my attention, actually, my brother pointed this out, because I hadn't really read the comments before, but there's quite a preponderance of them that are criticizing the fact that he doesn't actually reference any studies. I mean, he talks about some at a high level, but the fact that McCullogh brought like 40 studies that he referenced in the Rogan interview was something that people pointed out. That doesn't necessarily mean that that makes McCullogh more correct, but that is one data point that I hadn't, it hadn't occurred to me before, and is a fair one, I think.
Yeah, well, that was actually one of his critiques of McCulloch's strategy, wasn't it? Was that he said, look at all these 130 studies, right? And boom, and there's no possible way that the interviewer can counter, because there's no way they're going to read those 130 studies, right? So, and I actually think that's one of the valid points that ZDogg makes, is you can't, unless you are prepared to actually offer a synopsis of one or all of those studies when you make that comment, it's like a document dump, right? You can't respond to it in the moment. And it can. I'm not saying Peter McCullogh did use that as a tactic. They may be entirely legitimate studies, every single one of them, the ones that he was mentioning, right? I'm not saying he did do that, but that can absolutely be a tactic in a debate. Try and make it like, look at all these studies that back me up. Oh, well, okay, maybe.
Yeah. He's like, well, really, you need 2 hours to look at a study if you're doing it right. I mean, yeah, it takes time. It was, I think, toward the end, around 59, I had a note. Steve, is it Kirsch or Kirsch? Kirsch, I think.
Yeah, Kirsch, yeah.
That's so McCullogh was saying, I'll debate anybody if he comes along, and that's where ZDogg was saying, well, I know Hirsch's tactic is basically talk a mile a minute and throw all these studies in there, and you can't really, it's that in a debate sort of format. So, and that's a fair, I guess, critique too. One thing that, well, maybe we can circle back to the original things that you took issue with, and we can kind of pick those apart, but
I think it probably makes sense to work chronologically through the video. I think just in terms of viewability rather than jumping around. So my first thing that I've picked up on is at around 8 minutes. I've written down 8 minutes, whether it's exactly 8 minutes or whether that's approximate, I'll have to find out. Have you got anything prior to 8 minutes?
A couple notes. Yeah, McCullogh being over positive on natural immunity. He talks about this a few times, just the bias, whatever side you're on, there's a tendency to over emphasize the benefits of whatever you're for. Like if you're pro-vax, that, if you're natural immunity, that. Yeah, just that tendency. And then, also so a little bit before 8, he talks about some of the things he's going to critique, including like the moving the goalposts, like being unable, like it's impossible to move somebody off. Like that's what he critiques about McCullogh. It seems like it's impossible to move him off a position. He's like, I think that's the main critique, because he talks about someone else toward the end where he doesn't agree with everything he says, but he would rather
respect the fact that they're willing to change their position. Yeah.
Exactly.
No, I understand.
Yeah.
No, I think that's what I think he makes many valid criticisms of McCullogh and the interviewing tactics. That I do. I think he makes many valid criticisms, but I also think that he falls victim to a couple of the same things himself. I think he is a victim of his own biases without realizing on a couple of occasions himself, and I think he fails to provide. This is my biggest criticism. There's a couple of spots where he makes statements, but assumes context with which I profoundly disagree. Right, in my opinion, he's assuming inappropriate context to making those statements. So, yeah, that's broadly my sense. So I would say like 60 or 70% of what he says in the video, I broadly speaking agree with. Right, that. The cherry picking of information to support your position and the unwillingness to give serious credence to opposing positions, the willingness to discard things that disagree with you, and so on and so on. I think all of these are general points, and I think they apply to lots and lots and lots of people on all sides of this debate, those kinds of criticisms. But given that given that ZDogg is sort of holding himself up as a critic of that sort of practice, then he should not indulge in it himself. And I think 8 minutes is a good example of that. We'll play the clip in a second, but I don't even know actually who he's referring to, but he refers to someone as the demon sperm lady, right? Do you know who he's talking about, demon sperm lady?
I think so. Someone associated with America's Frontline Doctors or whatever, that kind of conservative medical group. I think she's like African, and there's a I don't know if it's viral or not, but there's a clip of her saying something related to demon sperm. It was a while back that I saw that, so I don't remember too many details, but yeah, that's my recollection.
Anyway, it just seemed like for someone who is modeling themselves as a fair commentator, right, and analyst, shouldn't be using terms like that to describe anyone, right? You know, in my. But let me play the clip, because that's not the only thing. So I'm not sure if this is going to come across in the video. If not, I'll edit it. I'll edit it in later, but I'll do it as a screen share now.
So understand my bias. I like vaccines a lot. I'm very skeptical of therapeutics, because I like vaccines because they use the body's natural immune defenses and train them. And I trust the body. Therapeutics treatments try to circumvent what the body does, try to hack around it. And historically, vaccines have a much better idea of preventing disease than therapeutics do about preventing or treating, just historically. So the pre-test probability of a therapeutic working is much, much lower than a good vaccine. So that's my bias. I also am biased because throughout the pandemic, I've been dealing with a lot of misinformation on both sides of the political aisle. But it's, for some reason, the conservative side of the misinformation aisle has been really, really wacky. So you have America's Frontline Docs with the demon sperm lady talking about hydroxychloroquine and all of that. And I've had to go and debunk these things over the course of the pandemic. And it's
okay. Let's stop there. That covers everything that I wanted to say. So yeah, two things. Firstly, his point about vaccines versus therapeutics. Like, vaccines are better because they're preventative. They're relying on the body's existing own mechanisms of defense rather than introducing some new mechanism, right? Which is going to be in conflict with. And all of this I agree with. However, these are not vaccines in the sense that these vaccines do exactly that. They hack into your body and cause it to do something it doesn't ordinarily do, right? It hacks into it goes into your cells, unlike other vaccines. This is what I mean. He conflates these vaccines with all other vaccines, and this is entirely unjustified. These are entirely new, right? These are not introducing, what are they called? Attenuated viruses to the body. Yeah, that float around in the body, the immune system becomes familiar with. And these are things which enter the cells and reprogram the cells to manufacture a piece of the virus, which then exposes itself on the cell surface so that the immune system can recognize it, right? They are fundamentally different. And to say that he doesn't like therapeutics because it's a hack on the body, and then say he does like these vaccines because they are also a hack on the body, right? It's in my opinion, this is a really fundamental misrepresentation of the vaccine thing. I have one other point on this, unless you want to respond to that first. There's one other point I wanted to make, but if you want to go ahead and respond to that.
Yeah, I think that's fair. That although he does address later the fact that it's new as far as a human, like the mRNA approach. It's around 48, I guess, but he also points out, which I think is a fair bias, and some folks who are will take, like, say, monoclonal antibodies or other things that that might have issues or haven't been used that much before, but not a vaccine. It's just like the bias kind of goes either way, depending on whether you like therapeutics or vaccines. But yeah, I think that's a fair point as far as he's kind of talking about historical vaccines, which generally there's a good history and good data on all kinds of vaccines.
As I say, broadly, his point I agree with, that prevention is better than cure. Vaccine to prevent you getting the infection is better than treating the infection when you've got it. I completely agree with those points, but these vaccines do not belong in that category of vaccines that he's talking about in that sense, because they are not, and they don't prevent infection, right? It has become absolutely apparent that they are not preventing infection, and therefore treatment is necessary despite having had the vaccine, right? So it's vaccine and treatment now. So, it really, in my opinion, that statement just doesn't hold up at all. And his other thing is that he's tired of having to contend with disinformation by the people like the demon sperm lady around things like hydroxychloroquine, right? And again, he has made an assumption in there that hydroxychloroquine is absolutely not effective at treating COVID. And there are still a very large number of doctors out there who say it is effective, and they are continuing to use it, and they're still getting good results with it. Same thing with ivermectin, right? I mean, I think they're very parallel stories, the hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin. And hydroxychloroquine in particular was tarnished with being mentioned by Trump, right? That anything that Trump mentioned must by definition be stupid and wrong. He said hydroxychloroquine, therefore hydroxychloroquine must be stupid and wrong. And, you know, listen, I haven't gone into all the evidence, but there are people that I trust in, people like Brett Weinstein, for example, right, who said that he too had dismissed the whole hydroxychloroquine thing. But since he saw what happened around the ivermectin, he went back and re-examined it. And actually, there is a lot of very solid evidence to suggest that hydroxychloroquine. And so it's been widely accepted in the culture now that hydroxychloroquine is useless, but there are still a very large number of highly credentialed people out there touting its effectiveness, although we don't hear it anymore because we've moved on to other stories.
Yeah, I think the Trump hydroxychloroquine thing kind of got it got intermingled with the like therapeutics versus vaccines things. So people who were yeah, but I don't know, it kind of got, originally it was like along across political lines, and then it became more its own kind of bias or ideological capture, which to some extent I think we probably disagree on this a little bit too, but there was an extent to which Brett Weinstein was actually was showing some signs of ideological capture. Verbal Wisdom did a few different pieces on this. So
yeah, I wasn't happy about those either, but that's for another day.
Yeah,
maybe we can do that next time. Actually, maybe we can have a look at that next time. That's a good idea. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Apologies.
No problem. Yeah, I mean, it was an ongoing thing for several weeks. I think Rebel Wisdom put out a few different pieces and was really trying to thread the needle there. It's challenging, and you know, especially even when people are aware of and acknowledge their biases and shadows and things, it's hard to always account for them. Yeah, I guess several minutes later, he kind of circles back to some of the reasons why so like with America's Frontline Doctors, why he takes things that they put out with kind of a grain of salt, because they have also made some other, taken some positions that some might consider crazy, including that HIV doesn't cause AIDS, homosexual behavior does, and that abortions cause breast cancer. There's a you know, conservative leaning, maybe not quite, you know, completely tethered to reality, set of claims from that group. So I feel like something went out of my head that I wanted to address as far as what you were saying. Well,
but if you don't mind, I've got something I'd like to say at this point anyway, because oh shit, that's just slipped out of my mind as well. Oh yeah, no, but so that he treats everything that these frontline doctors say with a grain of salt because they've made some outrageous claims as well, right? And yeah, this is like a baby in bathwater, right? You know, like Neil Ferguson at Imperial College made outrageous claims with his original modeling of what was going to happen with the COVID pandemic, right? Yet we don't discard everything that he ever says or ever has said before or since because of, you know, not just that, various instances of what turned out to be outrageously inaccurate modeling, right? And yet the scientific community doesn't shun him and discard everything that he ever says, right? So why do some people get singled out for, hey, you said some wacky things, so we're not going to listen to anything you say, as opposed to someone else who's said some wacky things, but we continue to listen to what they have to say?
I'm not as familiar with this, you know, what happened with Ferguson, but is he somebody who's changed his, like he did some...
He was the man responsible for the lockdown frenzy in Europe, probably, because he produced this model right at the beginning of the pandemic. He produced this model which told us that 500,000 people were going to die in the next 6 months if we didn't, you know, if we didn't take serious action. And it was based on a whole bunch of assumptions which were questioned at the time, but the question, you know, this was the beginning of dissenting voices not being listened to, right? I mean, there were loads of people who pointed out Neil Ferguson's record of being way over the top with his modeling in the past, right? And B, pointing out erroneous assumptions that he was using in this model, which were likely exaggerating the outcomes of it, right? I mean, you know, any model is only producing whatever assumptions and data you're putting into it, right? And
Yeah.
so, you change the assumptions, you change the outcomes. And so, this was criticized at the time. And yet that model was the one that was seized upon to say, hey, we really need to take this seriously. And even when it was subsequently demonstrated to have been wildly exaggerated, and that other models that were done at the time turned out to be much more reflective of what actually happened, his modeling was continue to be preferred over the other modeling, right? So my question is, why does this, oh well, they've done something completely out of order, therefore we're not listening to them anymore? I don't get it. That's kind of my question.
Yeah, in that case, it's probably it's more about the tendency of the I don't know, the prevailing institutions or sources of power, like what they would prefer. They prefer more control. So a model that shows, more dire consequences would lead to that. So that's probably a factor there. I remember the thing that that I wanted to bring in, which is just like with ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. It over the course of paying attention to that whole debate, it became clear that there were a mix of studies of varying quality with different results, and depending on which ones you pointed to, you could either say yes or no as far as effectiveness. So in some cases, it's like the jury's out. And I feel like ZDogg generally does a good job of threading that needle of like, there's some studies showing this, some that, either we need more studies, or in some cases they'll say, well, the preponderance is pretty clear, it's this or that. But with those therapeutics, my sense at this point is that there's some evidence, certainly. And I think if doctors want to prescribe it, then that should be allowed. You see stories about that being denied, even when the doctor wants it and the patients want it, or the patients want it and the family. And that just seems like another one of those things where it's like it's over the bias of the sort of thesis position is at play there in ways that can be harmful.
Yeah, and it also it adds fuel to the fire for those who wish to see it all as some kind of evil grand conspiracy, right? God, you're not even letting doctors do their jobs, right? That kind of, and yeah, as I say, it all adds fuel to that fire.
Yeah.
My next one is at 1715.
Okay.
All right, so who are these people? So Scott Atlas is a radiologist from the Hoover Institution here at Stanford who served on Trump's advisory committee. He's a radiologist. He has some expertise in policy. He's a very smart guy. I think he'll be proven to be right about a lot of the stuff he said, but he's not at all an expert on whether there's a conspiracy or not around hydroxychloroquine. Pam Popper is a naturopath, so not a medical doctor, who sells stuff around natural wellness and writes books about that stuff. So she's an expert on this. How? And Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is a lawyer, the son of Bobby Kennedy, and a longtime professional anti-vaccine activist. He has said things like the following. Hey, Mr. Kennedy, are there any vaccines you think that have ever had a historical benefit? And he says, I don't think I can answer that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess this is kind of along similar lines to the point that I was making before, that just because these people are not trained in one specific field, does that precludes them having an informed opinion about something? That doesn't mean that they don't have the ability to look at things and read things and understand things and form a well-considered opinion about things. And surely anyone in any field should be looking for interested, informed opinions from outside the field, because it means that things are seen with, from perspectives through a fresh pair of eyes that people who are stuck in a field can't necessarily. So to dismiss the contributions of those simply because they are not trained in a particular field, I think, again, I think this is revealing of his own biases, right? Like, I don't want to hear what these people have to say, and so I'm going to dismiss them by undermining their credibility. That's what it feels like.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's certainly fair that, I get a little, I have a little bit of an allergic reaction to the notion that you can only get, wisdom or good information or good analysis from people with a specific credential. At the same time, I think the point he was making here was that again, just sort of like paying attention to the approach that McCullogh is taking and trying to advance his points. I guess it's kind of like if the best people you can reference to help support this thing are this mix of, mostly not, well, I don't know if it's mostly, but certainly a lot of the ones he mentioned by name were not physicians. It's kind of I guess you could look at it different ways. Like it's a sign that it's a minority position among physicians. Like if you couldn't find, a few, physician names to put in, or maybe he's with the Kennedy one, obviously it's because he's got a kind of a profile. So, and that's maybe fair too, as far as, especially since he critiques the fact that he hasn't been willing to acknowledge the effectiveness of previous vaccines, or he kind of gives a non-answer, right? Like he said, I can't really answer that. I don't know. I feel like it's kind of a mix of sort of like fair enough. But at the same time, I agree with what just the general position. Like if his general position is you shouldn't pay attention to an opinion unless somebody has XYZ credential, which I don't think if pressed he would actually say that that's always the case. But yeah, I guess so. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag for me.
Also, this may just be a semantic point, but I don't think so. I think it's more than that. There's a difference between having an opinion about whether hydroxychloroquine is effective or not, and having an opinion about whether there is institutional suppression of its effectiveness, right? And I think someone like Robert Kennedy Jr. is actually uniquely well qualified to know whether or not there is institutional pressure being put on suppressing the fact that let's just put for one moment the argument aside. Let's just say it is quite effective, right? And well, no, sorry, I'm saying this really badly, but hey, what these people are commenting on is the ability of pharmacological companies and governments and so on to suppress information regarding a therapeutic which might be very effective, right? That's kind of their argument, right? That there are well-credentialed people who are saying it is effective, and we have no reason to think these people are lying, and therefore the only reason that it is not being accepted is that there is suppression of it, right? Now that last bit is a bit of a leap, but I think certainly Bobby, I don't know who the woman is that he refers to, the naturopath. I don't know who she is, but certainly Robert Kennedy Jr. has been in politics for a very long time, has been an activist for a very long time, will have a lot of contacts. He's a Kennedy as well, right? I mean, he's going to know a lot of the machinations of power that go on behind the scenes. So I think he's uniquely well qualified in that domain.
In some ways, maybe you could argue that Kennedys would tend to see conspiracy more because of what happened to JFK.
And so we listen to what he says, understanding that he has that bias. We don't dismiss what he has to say.
Yeah. I guess I think the point that ZDogg makes that we probably agree on is that, like you said, that leap to conspiracy, and he points out the fact that under certain kinds of thinking, that becomes like you can't convince somebody out of it because it's like, well, the conspiracy.
Yeah.
Well, the conspiracy.
Everything
right?
can be explained by the conspiracy. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Whereas like probably a more realistic view would recognize that it's more about the forces of incentives and all these different structures around the healthcare system. I mean, definitely pharmaceutical profits is one thing, but I mean that's one factor. But he points out a couple of inconsistencies there where there are some therapeutics, what is it, dexamethasone. If there's a conspiracy against therapeutics, why the dexamethasone? So just again, just kind of critiquing that conspiratorial thinking and like falling back on that. The better position, well, so that there are these factors that lead to kind of like what might look like suppression of these therapeutics, but it's more likely incentives and different structures involved in that.
And reasonable caution could look like suppression to some people, right? If they're inclined to view things in those. Yeah. No, absolutely. That's valid. That's a valid point.
Yeah, I guess my sense is that the distinction should be whether somebody almost like religiously, like they don't need like additional facts won't convince them out of the possibility or that the conspiracy is the explanation. Whereas with like really critical thinking, because we've seen things that were thought to be conspiracy and were dismissed as conspiracy theories, right? All the stuff that happened around JFK and MK Ultra and all these conspiracies that actually we have, but it's like in order to confirm a conspiracy, we can hold it as a possibility in our mind, but if we don't have the evidence yet, then it's like we shouldn't religiously look to that as the explanation maybe.
But then they doesn't that mean that they only ever end up getting confirmed after they've already happened and done their thing, right? That's it.
Yeah. I guess the balance should be like, hold the theory as a theory and don't dismiss it out of hand, and look for evidence, and keep an open mind.
Yeah, I mean that's all you can. But that applies to the others. That applies to any position, right? Is hold it lightly and be willing to let it go and take another one at least temporarily, kind of thing. So much easier to say than it is to do.
Yeah.
I mean that thing about the finance. I'm pretty sure that's another thing that I've got written down. The money around therapeutics. What is that?
Yeah, well, at 22, I have a note. It says claims that therapeutics are more profitable.
Oh, yeah, there we go. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't think we need to play the clip because that's exactly the point. So we both got something on this. So go on, you say your thing about it first.
Well, so what ZDogg is saying is, and I didn't put details, but he says that there's some therapeutics at least that have more profit potential than vaccines. So that doesn't fit with the narrative. It's a conspiracy for pharmaceutical profits. And then also he points out, can
I just push back on that one before you go on to the next thing? Sure. Yeah. I mean, again, in a general sense, I think that's a valid point. But in this particular context, in this particular example, it's nonsense, right? I mean, the idea is for every single person on this planet to be vaccinated on a regular basis, on a regular ongoing basis, right? We haven't even started yet. What therapeutic is taken by everyone on the planet? Do you know what I mean? So in this particular example of vaccines, that's simply not true. The number of doses that are going to be manufactured and the profit margin per dose are enormous. I can't remember what the numbers are, but it's something like, in fact, I don't even want to say it because I really can't remember. But Pfizer are making a huge margin on these vaccines. And so, listen, I don't know what their margins are on therapeutics, but in this particular example, Pfizer in particular, for whatever reason, this is the one the world seems to want, despite the fact it has to be stored at -60 and all of this kind of stuff. This is the one the world wants. But yeah, they are making vast fortunes. Their profits were up either 117 or 170% last year, right? And that's on the back of the vaccine, plain and simple. So yeah, the point he's making is true in a general sense, but is absolutely untrue in this particular case. And so this is actually, I hadn't noticed this, but this is, I guess, one of my meta gripes with him, right? Is that he makes true statements, but fails to make clear that he's making a general statement and is not making a statement in the context of COVID, right? He's either, I don't know whether he's doing it on purpose or whether he doesn't realize there's a difference between the two contexts, right? Between the general and the specific of COVID. But yeah, this is at least the second time now I'm pointing out that, yeah, he's making a generally true statement, but is untrue in this example?
Yeah, I'd have to dig in a bit or understand what he was saying with that particular therapeutic being potentially more profitable. I would agree. My sense has been, and I would agree that he doesn't seem to acknowledge they're pretty clearly, well, for one thing, like enmeshment of the pharmaceutical industry with government and with media, like corporate, mainstream, like media. They're basically like some of the main CNN shows. It's like brought to you by Pfizer. And then they bring on, they bring on pharmaceutical executives to tell you about. They're the ones giving you the information about vaccines, and it's basically just like free, commercial time. And they try, yeah. And so I feel like he his biases don't, or at least I haven't seen him acknowledge that quite as much. I think he's acknowledged some, but yeah. So I think we generally agree on that. Although I kind of want to understand what he was saying about the therapeutic, because I haven't
I think the main point
that.
of therapeutics is that therapeutics are ongoing, right? Like so a therapeutic drug that can be, taken again and again and again. Right. You have a year's mark, whereas a vaccine you take it one time and that's it. And as I say, in a general sense, I agree with him. But this vaccine is being taken by way more people than any other vaccine has any been taken by, and it's not just one dose. It's at the moment, at least, looks like a continually ongoing program. I mean, my own personal sense, this is all going to come to a stop pretty soon. And move on to something else to frighten us with, but whatever. That's my own personal sense.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. My brother sent out a note on some channel saying, like, now that COVID seems to be dying down, watch out for Russian and what was the other one? Anyway, the thing's going to go to some other threat that we need to.
I'm hearing it's going to be climate catastrophes caused by manipulation of weather systems. This is by deliberate manipulation of weather systems. This is what I'm hearing. Anyway, whatever. Who the fuck knows?
Yeah, keep an eye out. We'll see.
Let's try not to get too far off topic here.
Yeah. Okay, so that's that one. He talks about nurses versus doctors in terms of that one. I don't know. I could see how some people might almost see that as like insulting, because he's saying basically the doctors are more trained in like looking at science and reviewing papers and things. And so the fact that nurses are getting vaccinated less than doctors, kind of like nurses are more intuitive and doctors are more rational, basically what you're saying. There's some other data points that could be brought in here too.
Sorry, but if I may, I think that's probably broadly speaking true, but I would suggest that it's the nurses who are actually seeing people being vaccinated and experiencing, because you see, the thing is, nurses don't see all the loads and loads and loads of people that have vaccinations with little or no consequence. They don't see them. They only see the people that have problems, right? And so they will get a very distorted, embodied sense of the hazards associated with the vaccines, right? Because they're seeing all the injuries and none of the non-injuries, right? Do you know what I mean? And so they get a very, very distorted sense of it. So I can absolutely understand why the nurses are one of the biggest groups of not wanting to take the vaccine.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's valid. I saw Minnesota nurses talking with, I think it was a state representative, and they were talking about all the negative things that they're seeing, and the fact that they're basically discouraged from reporting them to VAERS, the vaccine adverse event reporting system, because they can't, like, they're so busy on their shifts. It's like, don't take the time to do the reporting during your shift. If you want to do it after your shift. But a lot of them are just like, well, we think it's important enough to do it, but their concern is that those pressures are leading to a lot of underreporting. Mm-hmm. So that's one factor. And then also a study that I've seen referenced in a few different places that PhDs are the least likely to be vaccinated, and they also pay attention to information. It's almost like a valley, like in the middle, like a master's degree is highly vaccinated. On the lower end of the education thing, it's highly unvaccinated, and then the PhD is highly unvaccinated. So something interesting going on there.
Yeah, I mean, the implication is, this is an oversimplification, right? But the implication would be like, at the lowest end of the educational spectrum, you have suspicious for no good reason, right? Just suspicious because you get the shit end of the wedge all the time, right? And that's just kind of what you expect, right? So yeah, exactly. And then you have the sort of blissfully ignorant, and then at the other end of the spectrum, you have the reluctant because they know too much, right? Reluctant because they don't know enough. Don't know enough to be reluctant because they know too much.
Yeah, there's a few different memes I've seen basically on that. But I think we probably dealt with that point enough. What's
my next note is at 29 minutes, groupthink.
Mass psychosis. Yeah, goes both ways was his point, which I think is fair, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this was actually an occasion where I wanted to congratulate him for making that point, right? That whole thing of groupthink exists. Yeah, across many dimensions. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, McCullogh was pointing out the how it applies and to sort of the thesis position in COVID. Vaccines were good, masks were, all those things, and the threat and the isolation with lockdowns and everything. So it's like all those things are fair points as far as what could lead to
that mass hypnosis thing, isn't it? It was the 5 stages of mass hypnosis, and there's work done on this, right? I can't remember what the guy's name is, but there's a guy who's written a detailed thesis on this phenomenon and has cited historical example and blah blah blah. And I think this paper was released relatively recently because it's been picked up in a few places and has been cited. But I mean, I haven't gone deeply into it, but from what it feels very plausible, that kind of thing, like that, totalitarian regimes would have used exactly this kind of thing in the past. And if you look back at Soviet Russia, at Maoist China, at Pol Pot's Cambodia, at Nazi Germany, you know what I mean? It's exactly this kind of thing. It's so fear and confusion, don't really know what it is you're supposed to do exactly in order to stay within the rules. And if you don't, you get carted off or punished or whatever in some way. And this constant climate of uncertainty and fear. And then, here we go. Here's a solution to all your uncertainty and fear. That's a potent mixture. It really is.
Yep. Was it Matthias, wasn't it?
Yeah, that sounds right. Yes, I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's from Germany or something, or Austria, I think. But yeah, he's been making the rounds on different podcasts talking about this. And then, of course, McCullogh brought it into Rogan, which was, I think, the first time a lot of people had heard of it, because there were a whole bunch of pieces and things written about it kind of in response. But it's a fair point that there's all these markers on the sort of thesis side of the COVID debate, but also on the antithesis side, it's like, the same kind of like capture or, it applies both ways. Which
I completely agree.
Makes sense. The next few things are like the amount of like he credits Rogan for being curious and asking questions, but also just that he can't respond real time to any. He points out a couple of like CDC data refutes what McCullogh was saying about some claim that he was making, and the fact that Rogan can't, in the moment, actually debate that. So, and then toward the end, he suggests that Vinay Prasad would be a good person for Rogan to talk to, because he looks at both sides of things and really tries to come to a synthesis. So he's knowledgeable, but he's not as sort of ideologically captured as McCullogh seems to be.
I would imagine Rogan would be willing. I mean, it seems to me Joe Rogan's pretty willing to talk to anyone that might throw light on stuff and is willing to talk to him,
Yep. Yeah, so we'll see if that one happens. But I've been paying a little bit of attention to Vinay Prasad too. He and ZDogg sometimes talk to each other, and then just him on his own. Just another sort of useful kind of synthesis source that I've been getting value from. then he gets into how, yeah, like both sides overemphasize the benefits of their preferred intervention, vaccine versus natural. Oh, and then around 39, the kind of absolute risk versus relative risk. I thought
Yeah,
that was
I've got that written down as well.
Versus relative risk reduction. So the difference is kind of like this. What's my absolute risk of getting COVID right now? Well, it's pretty small, right? Because I don't go out and all that. So I get a vaccine. How much did it drop my absolute risk? Well, it turns out my absolute risk was already low, so it can't drop it much lower. So the absolute risk reduction is quite low. Vaccines in general are like that, unless it's so prevalent in the community that your absolute risk of COVID is so high. So why do we use relative risk with COVID vaccines? Because relative risk says relative to an unvaccinated person, what's your risk reduction with vaccine? Now that's an important measure, because if I didn't get vaccinated versus I did, I dropped my risk of infection by X, or severe disease by X. That's where you hear a 90% reduction in severe disease, right? Relative to not being vaccinated. That's a useful metric.
Okay, that's good enough, I think.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
my gripe with that is, again, not, I mean, he's drawn the distinction correctly. I mean, he's not misinformed, right? He has correctly identified what the difference is between absolute and relative risk reduction, but once again has not put it in the proper context, right? He's talking about, you know, if I've got X risk of catching COVID, well, this has got nothing to do with catching COVID, right? This is to do with getting seriously ill or dying if you catch COVID, right? This is where the risk reduction lies. The risk reduction doesn't lie in catching it. It lies in getting seriously ill if you do catch it, right? So, you know, let's look at that. What is your risk of getting seriously ill or dying if you catch COVID without having a vaccine? And for most people, right, for the overwhelming majority of people, it is, you know, it's like point something of a percent. If you're under 50 years old, it's like 0.1% is your chance of getting seriously ill or dying of COVID. And so, you know, you are 99.9% assured if you don't have the vaccine, and 99.99% assured if you do have the vaccine. And so, yeah, there's a 90% relative risk reduction, but a 0.09 absolute risk reduction, right? Which is absolutely negligible, nothing. And so, you know, once again, he has given true information, but miscontextualized it really badly, in my opinion. It's got nothing to do with catching. It's about getting seriously ill and dying. And the chances of that happening are very low anyway. And so your meaningful risk reduction is essentially zero.
Yeah, I'm not solid on the specific numbers, but I think, so the point he's making is, and he does talk in that clip we just showed, he was talking about like 90% reduction of, what was it, hospitalization and death. So, I mean, there's also, if we're just looking at, you know, the percent that die with COVID versus, you know, unvaccinated versus vaccinated, there's also the, you know, the length of time you have it, the amount of suffering you undergo, the chance for long COVID, you know, all these things. And
you're probably infectious for another day or two with the lengthened symptoms without the vaccine, right? You've probably got another day or two where you can potentially transmit it to others. No, I understand all of this. I'm not saying there is a zero risk reduction. I'm saying that he is characterizing the relative risk reduction of 90% as being highly significant. And so, yeah, anyway, I've made my point. I kind of made it twice. Sorry for being boring. I've kind of made the same point twice.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I think, again, his bias is, and this comes up later when he talks about the VAERS reporting, and he seems to think that it's likely to be very complete because, you know, everybody's paying attention to this. And that seems to be somewhat refuted by the Minnesota nurse talk that I referenced, where, you know, they're seeing all these adverse events and being discouraged from reporting them. So that might be a little bit of a blind spot for ZDogg. So let's imagine that if the vaccine had zero risk, like we couldn't find any adverse events, going to be a no-brainer to take it
Correct.
because it's like there's negative things from the COVID. The balancing thing is like, well, are there any negative impacts from the vaccine? And it's like, yeah, we see this myocarditis. People are reporting other things, and maybe it's being underreported. So it's like, at the end of the day, it's we want the truth and whatever the data shows. So if we can really get good data that hasn't been skewed by, being kind of suppressed or discouraged in terms of reporting and all that kind of thing. So we'll see if we get there, but I feel like that would be his position. And in this case, he always tends to lean a little, like you said at the beginning, I like vaccines, over therapeutics, and that's one of my biases. So in that, it's sort of borne out here.
Yeah, and like I said, I agree with that point. I like vaccines too. I mean, the notion of being able to have an injection that immunizes you potentially for your whole life against something which could make you seriously ill or die with little in the way of consequence, that sounds, as he says, that utilizes the existing mechanisms of your body and just trains them, right? It just gives them a bit of pre-training. Absolutely, I think it's wonderful, but these are not that anyway. We've made this point. Just on the VAERS thing, the VAERS signal, because this is a really interesting discussion, because I kind of see the arguments both ways for this one, right? A lot of people that do have adverse reactions to the vaccines will just shrug them off, right? Because they're relatively minor. It's a bit of arm pain, or they feel fatigue for a couple of days, or a bit of chills, and it all goes away in a day or two, and they feel okay, and so they don't worry about it, right? And so I think at that level, there's a massive amount that goes underreported, but is that of any real consequence, right? So yeah, that's one part of it. But serious adverse events, I mean, the way I've read the VAERS literature and the way it's supposed to be used, and any adverse event at all, whether or not it's attributed to any adverse event at all that occurs within 3 months after vaccination is supposed to be reported to VAERS. It's not up to the person that had the adverse reaction to decide whether or not it's vaccine related, right? All potential adverse reactions to vaccines are supposed to be reported, and then they are supposed to be investigated and see, was this attributable to the vaccine, or is this something nothing to do with the vaccine, right? There's supposed to be follow-up investigation to the VAERS reports. And so VAERS in principle is supposed to over-report, right? All incidences are supposed to be reported, and not all incidences will be vaccine related. So in principle, there should be an over-reporting. However, in practice, whenever someone is administered the vaccine, the person who administered the vaccine is supposed to monitor them immediately afterwards for any adverse events and report them, and encourage the person to report any adverse events they experience to VAERS if it happens in the next 90 days, right? This is how it's supposed to work. But I know 4 or 5 people who had not serious, but quite serious reactions to the vaccine. None of them were advised to report it. This is in the UK, not VAERS, but it's the same thing. It's called the yellow card scheme in the UK. It's essentially the same thing. None of them were encouraged to report it to the yellow card scheme. And one of them actually asked, should I report it? And they said, no, don't worry about it. So, the reality of it seems to be that it is being underreported, even though the ethos of the thing should encourage over-reporting. So, like I said, I can see the arguments in both directions.
Yeah. There's certainly, and I mean, just thinking about the logistics and the effort required to actually do all those kind of follow-ups. Like, people are getting vaccinated in various different contexts, including, walk-in clinics and things like. Are the people that administer those going to follow them up?
No, this is the thing. This is one of my biggest problems with all of this, is that this is still a phase 3 trial, right? I mean, like it or not like it, the fact is this is still a phase 3 trial, and phase 3 trials require careful monitoring of all participants and thorough reporting of any possible adverse events. And it really feels to me like we would rather sweep adverse events under the carpet so as to avoid vaccine hesitancy than face up to the possibility that maybe these vaccines aren't as safe as we thought they were, right? And, do we actually want to know if there is a serious health risk involved with taking these vaccines? I mean, do we as a culture actually want to know that, or would we rather pretend it's not there and keep taking them? I really don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah, well, partly it's the whatever cultural and political divides that this thing has been sort of brought into. In general, like if we were in an environment where that wasn't so much a factor, it's like, yeah, people want like the honest information from all, you know, the whole spectrum, and then it's like make their decisions, you know, based on all that. So if leadership actually, well, I think it was Japan where, yeah, we talked about this. The Japanese authorities are basically their approach with the citizens is like, this is the best information we have at this point. These are the things that we are recommending. Based on that, we may revise these at, you know, some point based on new information. You know, do what you think makes sense based on that. It's like, it's really treating their citizens like adults versus, you know, a lot of other countries being like, well, we got to really hammer home the vaccine things and discount anything that makes that look risky because we don't want hesitancy. So it's really treating the population more like children. Yeah, we'll see if we are able to get to it seems like we're converging. There's enough evidence now with Omicron being less, you know, much less deadly. And yeah, the fact that all these breakthrough infections, so it kind of doesn't matter as much whether you're vaccinated or not. Like, it seems like we're getting to a more realistic
Did you
place.
hear in the UK they've suspended all of the COVID regulations? Have you heard about this? No more masks.
Yeah, I just saw a headline.
Passports. No, it's all gone. And I think this is going to, one by one, it's going to tumble all around the world now for exactly the reason you just said. Right? There's no containing this Omicron. Everyone's going to get it. Basically, doesn't look like all that many people are going to suffer all that badly from it, and hopefully that knocks the whole thing on the head.
Hopefully.
Treat
it's still
like treat the flu. You know, you have an annual injection when the winter season comes around, if you want to, if you're vulnerable, or if you want to, and that's it.
Yep. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if like Australia backs away or when, because they've gotten so authoritarian and, you know,
they've lost it. Wow.
Yeah.
Russell Brand showed I don't know if you saw it. Russell Brand showed a video of this like 40-year-old woman, something like that, getting carted off in a police van, 4 policemen handling her into a back of her. Did you see this?
I did. I saw that. Yeah. The guy recording it was like, "This is despicable. I can't believe you're doing this. Leave her alone. You know, I'm not proud to be an Australian right now." Yeah. Any other points we want to?
So that was absolute versus relative. Yeah, I think I've only really got one more.
Doctors cannot ask people or advocate people to take them because that's a violation of the Nuremberg Code to compel an experimental process on patients. So this is total bullshit. This is reiterating like a Bobby Kennedy anti-vaccine talking point, which is that these things are experimental. They're not FDA approved. No, sorry, Pfizer is FDA approved.
All right, I got to stop there because that triggered me quite strongly. I mean, this is exactly what we've just been talking about, right? And this is, people are going to have to check this out for themselves. But according to Robert Malone, and I know Robert Malone has got his own kind of, oh, well, he's another one of these nutters, right? But he really isn't. Anyway, whatever. According to Robert Malone, it is not the Pfizer vaccine which has been granted FDA approval. It is the BioNTech version of the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine which has been granted approval. But this is not the one which is in circulation. So the one which has been granted approval is not actually being administered. And it is the one which is still under EUA until January of next year, which is being administered. So people are going to need to double check this for themselves. This is a complicated and sort of subtle difference, but my understanding is that that is not true. That it is. And anyway, even if it is true of Pfizer, it is certainly not true of all of the other vaccines. They certainly are still under emergency use authorization, certainly all the other ones.
Yeah. So
go on.
Some of the language you're using there, I could see how it could be triggering. I thought the main point he was making there is that, so I guess McCulloogh's assertion was that if doctors are advocating to their patients to take the vaccine, then he was likening that to Nuremberg, where it's like compelled. And he's saying, well, it's not the same. It's yeah, doctors. And then there's going to be a range of different perspectives on this, but they're going to give their their best assessment of what to do, which I think is fair.
I mean, for me, this thing about the Nuremberg Code. This is about. I mean, the Nuremberg Code has actually been superseded by the Helsinki Protocols, right? The Helsinki Protocols are based on the law created at the Nuremberg during the Nuremberg Code, but essentially it's a little bit woollier, the language. I much prefer the Nuremberg Protocols, by the way. They're much clearer and simpler. They're principles, whereas the Helsinki starts to get bogged down in, but if this, then this, and if this, then this, and but anyway, the overriding point is informed consent, right? Coercion of any kind is unacceptable, right? This is the principle undergirding the whole thing, following on from the experimentation that was done in the camps and all of that, right? That this is never, ever, ever to be repeated. People are sovereign over their own bodies and are the sole arbiters of what can and cannot be done to them, right? This is the principle that's being enshrined here. And so informed consent is the point. I mean, I don't know whether it's Peter McCullogh made the point badly or whether ZDogg has transcribed it badly in his video. I'm really not sure of that, but whatever, the point is around informed consent. You need, in order to participate in any medical treatment, but certainly experimental medical treatment, you must be giving your informed consent, which means you have to be informed. And this is the argument, right? Is that people are not informed. They are having this recommended to them by their doctors without their doctors sufficiently informing them of the actual immediate risks, such as the, 1 in whatever it is, 10,000 myocarditis, and the unknown risks, right? I mean, even if there was no signal in bears and none of the myocarditis talk, even if there was none of that, we cannot know with any certainty that 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the road, there isn't going to be some consequence of taking these things, right? That possibility of unknown unknowns always has to be held. Until you've got, say, 20 years of safety data on something, you've always got to be somewhat wary, right?
Yeah, and people have different risk profile tolerances or preferences on all this stuff.
Anyway, so it's slightly deviated from the point. The point was about informed consent, and this is what triggers ZDogg, I think, as with a lot of other people, is when you say words like Nuremberg or Germany or things like this, they're straight away, oh, you're playing the Nazi card, and therefore that's it, you've lost the argument. And while I think there is some merit to that point, I also think that sometimes it is absolutely an applicable example or illustration.
Yeah, there's certainly times when it can be valid. But I think it's a bit hyperbolic, and I would agree with ZDogg at least that it's hyperbolic for McCullogh to bring that in with advocacy. If it was around mandates, maybe, because that's closer to requiring something without informed consent versus a doctor trying to do their best, and maybe they don't bring up the risks as much as maybe they could or ideally should, but they're kind of doing their best is what I think the point was.
I guess it depends on what you like. There's advocacy, like here's what I think, here's what I know, and here's what I think based on what I know. This is my recommendation to you, right? That would be advocacy. But any kind of, if you don't take it, then some terrible, right? And that now starts to become, so it can be a fine line, right? So I don't know what Peter McCullogh was talking about when he said advocacy of the type that I described at the beginning. Of course, I can't imagine any reasonable person having a problem with doctors doing that, right?
Yeah, if it does, right. And in some cases, they're probably, they've got blind spots or a bit captured by the prevailing thesis positions or whatever. Fair enough.
I mean, hey, that's true of all of us, right?
Yeah, right.
Doctors.
The next one.
I think there's actually more of that clip. I stopped it early because I just wanted to.
This is an emergency use authorization. Doctors can absolutely advocate for patients to take something in a pandemic. So this is, again, betraying his bias against any kind of control of individuals, which, listen, I share that bias. I think mandates are horrible. I hate it when people tell me what to do, but I think a physician advocating you to get a vaccine, advocating it, is not a Nuremberg violation. Mandates are probably a liberty violation. They probably backfire on some level. They create psychological reactance, and I think they would be unnecessary. And the number needed to save with those vaccination mandates versus the harm to society and vaccine trust in the future and losing staffing in hospitals, when you weigh those, I don't think it favors mandates. But that's a different conversation than this is a Nuremberg violation. So that's why you don't have to appeal to loony bin stuff like that to make an argument.
But yeah, I still resent the characterization as loony bin stuff, because it's not loony bin stuff. It may have been poorly articulated. And yeah, I mean, I completely agree with his point that calling doctors who advocate for their patients that they should take the vaccine, that is some kind of Nuremberg Code violation. On its face, I agree, it sounds silly, but that's not to say that it couldn't be, right? So the doctor that says no, this thing is absolutely safe, there are no worries at all, right? And they advocate for their patient by deliberately obfuscating or leaving out stuff that they do know about. That would be a violation of the covenant of informed consent, right? The covenant of do no harm, the covenant of conformed consent. That would be a violation of that.
Yeah, and I think we could imagine a scenario where people in the medical establishment were captured by some kind of like the government, like whether it's a totalitarian, socialist or whatever the case may be. There's so much pressure to advocate for something that it actually does become they're not doing informed consent, and that's probably kind of the picture that some people have in their mind, is even if it's not like done through official channels, maybe the prevailing the zeitgeist or whatever is putting that much pressure on doctors, which if you pay attention to certain things, it might look like that, but the reality is, from what I've heard, is there's really quite a range of opinions within the medical community on this stuff, and it's the thing that's detrimental is the shutting down of conversation or making it, because then it's hard to synthesize or impossible. And so, yeah, then you end up with these like polarized camps and not the bridges between to kind of figure out like, all right, you're paying attention too much to, certain things. Let's actually get a realistic picture here.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is the problem, isn't it, with centralized health messaging, is that you tend to end up with this one size fits all. Whereas doctoring at the level of doctor and patient is about, knowing the patient's situation and their risk profile and, responding according to that, not according to some set of edicts which are out there. Sure, there can be recommendations and protocols and whatever, but at the end of the day, the doctor-patient relationship is where medicine takes place. Surely, right? That's where the rubber hits the road. Is at that point. There has to be discretion for the doctor to adapt their treatment to the context and wishes of the patient.
Yeah, and the reality is there's all these incentives, insurance companies and the management, the administration of the hospitals trying to maximize profit and all that kind of stuff. But that's a whole other discussion.
No, I mean, what I was saying is kind of in the abstract, because what you're saying, all of those pressures still exist on that doctor talking face to face with the patient and doing their best. They're still subject to all of those pressures that you mentioned. Yeah.
I think McCullogh was asserting that there was something like 1 million. I'm not sure if it was deaths or just adverse events.
No, adverse events is the 1 million. Deaths is I think 40,000, something like that, in the VAERS signal, something like that.
Okay, and that's where I had a bit of a quibble, because ZDogg seems to think that adverse events are likely to be reliably reported versus what I was hearing from the Minnesota nurses and some other things, as far as like actually they're kind of discouraged from reporting. And then that was pretty much it for me. I had a few more notes, but nothing I think that's probably worth drilling into. We also talked about the Steve Kirsch part of McCulloogh's challenge to anyone to come debate him. It's like, well, if you're going to bring Kirsch, we know what he's going to do. Just talk a mile and like bring up all these studies and not really have a synthesis type of discussion.
In principle, though, I'd really like to see that Peter McCullogh or Robert Malone or someone like that. You know, someone who's Peter McCullogh is a little bit at times hyperbolic. I actually basically like him, and I think he speaks from the heart, and I think he speaks his best truth most of the time. Not to say he isn't subject to his biases as well, but for the most part. But Steve Kirsch, I don't get a good feeling about him. You know what I mean? There's something that feels not earnest and authentic about him, whereas McCullogh, you know, agree with him or disagree with him, I think he's speaking honestly, as you know, from his perspective. And so I get the same thing with Robert Malone.
The problem seems to be like some of these characters like McCullogh, like Malone, they start off rightly pointing out inconsistencies or issues with sort of the dominant, like the thesis position on certain things, and then they get kind of a slap or a pushback. There was one person who he was testifying in the Senate or something, and all the Democrats walked out. They're like, "There's a right-wing nut job," and he's like a doctor, you know, with real information, and that tends to lead to people digging in their heels and becoming more ideologically captured and unable to move off their position. So then that's when people can point out and be like, well, you know, look at how they won't change their mind. And that's so that ideally, you know, to be a spirit of like, you know, open dialogue throughout the whole thing, where it's like they bring up these points, other people are kind of like, well, that doesn't make sense based on the dominant narrative, but let's engage here. And that way, yeah, obviously you'd have more synthesis in that case than what we're seeing. So hopefully, I mean, that's what we're trying to model here, and then also, you know, just in our lives in general.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. I think it's a really good point. And yeah, I mean, I would say, but as in between when we got cut off, I was just saying that the hyperbolic language and defensiveness of position, you know, like unwillingness to change position, I think can be a consequence of not having felt heard in the first place, right? You know, like no one's actually taken what I said seriously or responded meaningfully to it, right? All I've had is attacks, you know, people calling me dangerous and a source of misinformation and deplatforming me from Twitter and all of this kind of thing. But no one's actually engaged with what I've said. And so, as you say, you dig your heels in harder and you shout it louder and your language gets more extreme and more hyperbolic because you've got something valuable to say and no one's listening. I can, well, not no one's listening, but sometimes the only people who are listening are people who maybe you'd rather weren't, you know. And now you get co-opted by a camp that you only really loosely identify with. Yeah, you agree on a couple of points, but actually, broadly speaking, that camp you'd rather not have anything to do with. But now you've been identified with it, right? Because they are retweeting what you're saying. Yeah, they're the ones that are talking about what you're saying. And so now your reputation becomes tarnished by association.
Yeah. In addition to and this ties into and maybe we'll get more into the dynamics of this with like the Brett Weinstein story, but there's like once people have been, and this happens with like, you know, cancellations or, you know, people that have been sort of booted from legacy institutions like the New York Times. It's like, then you find an audience or people to talk to who it can lead to kind of this ideological capture because, you know, you started off making valid points against the thesis position, but then you're sort of subtly encouraged and maybe not so subtly encouraged to adopt positions more. So it's, yeah, you see that kind of drift or that tendency toward ideological capture. So that's another issue that
well, I guess the question is, but again, this is a really good point. So, as you say, you get ostracized for calling out legitimate inconsistencies in the thesis. You get ostracized from the thesis institution, and then automatically now you get drawn towards the antithesis, right? And the ability for synthesis is robbed from you, right? Because you no longer have access to those in thesis. You are now, do you know what I mean? Like this binary thing of once you've left the thesis position, once you've questioned the thesis position, you are now automatically antithesis, right? You're not in the quest for synthesis. You are, and so whether it is true that you get captured by the antithesis position, or whether it just seems that way because the thesis has disavowed you, right? Or again, there's likely to be a spectrum here.
Yeah, it can become like a self-fulfilling prophecy, maybe, if because if you get, that's the whole thing with like cancellation or just this complete rejection, it cuts off, it cuts off that synthesis thing. So it's almost like the only sort of friendly ears or willing listeners become others who are sort of opposed to the thesis. And so it's easy to kind of get like, oh, this is reality now. Whereas it'd be better to have, bridges and ability to kind of synthesize between, no,
this is really good. This is food for more talk another time. This idea of the impossibility of synthesis once you've been ostracized from one camp or the other. It's well worth talking more about this. I like this. All right, should we call it a day there?
Sounds good. Yeah.